Hello everyone, this is September, and in a few days it will be the anniversary of the September 11th attack, or 9/11. For your parents, for teachers, this is not a history book thing, because it's something we remember, we lived through. But if you're a student, middle school, high school, you weren't born when this happened. And I wanted to just talk real quick about what it was. So 9/11, September 11th attack. This was September 11th, 2001. Terrorists attacked 4 places in the United States on that day. There used to be 2 very tall office buildings in New York City called the Twin Towers, called the World Trade Center. 2 super tall buildings, like twins, there in New York. They were like a landmark. Like when you think of New York, you think of Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, and you thought of these 2 buildings. Well, on September 11th, terrorists hijacked, that means you take over, they hijacked 4 airplanes. Not just the small little airplanes you might see in the Daytona Beach airport or whatever. These are big passenger planes that you've probably flown on yourself. They planned this for over a year. They hijacked these planes. They had terrorists on them that knew how to fly planes. They had weapons, we believe, box cutters, knives, things that were easy to conceal. Somehow they took over these planes, took over the pilots, probably killed them initially, not quite sure of all those details. And they flew the planes purposely, crashed them into 4 places in the United States. They flew one into one of those towers I told you about. Then they flew one into the second one. And then 2 others that we forget about, sadly sometimes. They flew one into the Pentagon. That's the big government building where all our military is in Washington, D.C. Flew it into that. The last plane was planning to hit somewhere else in Washington, D.C. It could have been the Capitol building or maybe even the White House. But the passengers on that plane, knowing that they had no chance to live, rose up, attacked the terrorists so that at least the plane would not hit whatever target the terrorists wanted to hit. And the plane crashed in the middle of a field in Pennsylvania. This was absolutely shocking, terrifying. An attack on American soil had never happened, ever, from a foreign country or terrorists or whatever. When the first plane hit, it was in the morning, like 8:40 something in the morning. I remember being a teacher at Atlantic High School, and it was on the news that a plane hit the building, because it was, a famous building. It was a big deal. We didn't know how big a plane. It seemed at first like maybe it was an accident and maybe a little small private plane. It wasn't until a little bit later that it became clear this was a major airplane that hit it. And then shortly after, when the second plane hit, now it was terror, because we realized this wasn't an accident. Someone is doing this on purpose. At that moment, we didn't know who, what country. Does this mean we're going to go to war? Like, all of these things at once. It was a terrible tragedy because people were caught in these buildings. There was so much fire and smoke from these planes hitting. Sadly, some people had to jump to their deaths out of these buildings that were 100 and something stories tall, because they were left with the terrible choice of either being killed by fire or jumping out of the plane. Jumping out of the building. And then at the Pentagon, people were killed in the planes, of course. but also in the buildings themselves. It was a horrible, horrible thing. If you've flown on an airplane in your lifetime, the long lines you have where you have to go through extra security and stuff, that happened because of 9/11. There was always security, but it wasn't like the security you see now. And that was because of what happened on 9/11. And for most of the next 20 years, whether you know it or not, the United States was at war. We invaded Afghanistan, which is the country that these terrorists came from. And soldiers went over there and fought and took, etc., for years. The guy that was the planner, the mastermind of this, was a terrorist named Osama bin Laden. And some years later, American forces tracked him down and killed him. It's only been recently that American troops have left Afghanistan in your young lifetime, only in the last year or two. So the whole world changed. We were concerned about security and threats and stuff in a way we never were before. It was a tragic, dark day. And let's not forget the firemen and policemen, because particularly in those two big buildings, when the buildings were burning, and as I didn't tell you, those buildings collapsed. But before they did, firemen and policemen ran up those steps because the elevators, of course, weren't working anymore after the planes crashed. And they went up those buildings trying to find and rescue people. And while hundreds of firemen and policemen were in the buildings collapsed, killing the people inside, not only the workers and stuff, but also those heroic firemen and women, police officers. So 9/11, besides thinking about the tragedy of the day, it's also a time to honor and remember what we call first responders, like policemen, fire, ambulance, the people that show up when there's an emergency, because knowing the danger they were going into, these brave men and women went and gave their lives. So 9/11 is a day to be somber, to remember tragedy, to honor those that gave their lives trying to rescue others, and to appreciate the country that we have. That's what 9/11 is about. And I encourage you, there's an assignment some of my classes have where you have to interview someone who remembers a big event and ask for their responses and what they felt like. Even if you're not in that class, I'd recommend you do that. Students, talk to your parents or whoever was of age and ask them, what do you remember about that terrible day? All right, this is Mr. Temple, and that's a little bit about what 9/11, September 11th, 2001 was about. Have a good day.